Nick Barton was awarded a master's degree in clinical psychology by Antioch University, California, and worked as a marriage, family, and child counselor. He ran outpatient psychotherapy clinics in Los Angeles and in New York that attracted a wide demographic of clients from all over the world. In the mid-1980s, Barton returned to the UK and spent the next 30 years of his working life as clinician, management executive, and leader in the addiction treatment field. His pioneering work encompassed support for families including children, professional training for addictions counselors in partnership with the University of Bath, and research and community-located recovery programs. Nick was one of the principal architects of the merger of 3 charities that resulted in the launch of Action on Addiction in 2007. Nick has been an advisor to numerous government and non-governmental bodies and organizations in both technical and policy areas. He's been a trustee of several charities, including the Nelson Trust, the European Association for the Treatment of Addiction, which he helped to found, and Substance Misuse Management in General Practice, and the National Domestic Abuse Charity, Save Lives.
My entry into addiction was in the UK. I was a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, and I was editing somebody's book, and I was looking for something to do, and as well. And somebody said there's a treatment centre half an hour from where I fetched up in the UK. And they said they think they're looking for a psychologist. So I went along and had an interview or a discussion. And they said we would like the help of a psychologist, and principally for treatment planning. And I said, well, okay. I had no idea what a treatment centre was, or what a 12-step program was, or any of that stuff. And a psychologist doing that sort of work in the UK at that time in 1985 was a rarity. But I entered into it in the right spirit, and thought this was something. I remember thinking something really interesting is going on here, something curious, and I'd like to learn what it is, and I'd like to, if I can, be able to help or contribute something. Just something about it, about possibly the kind of transformational aspect of it, and the people coming from a long way down to change in quite significant ways and very positive, and develop. That appealed. So I just got involved, and at first I was treated very rudely like some kind of alien because I was not 12-step, I'm not in recovery, and I used to sit in treatment planning meetings and make suggestions and hear loud grunts of disapproval from my point of view. Anyway, one thing led to another, and I actually assessed almost everybody who came through the door of this 55-bed treatment centre, and made my suggestions, and started to learn more myself about addiction and the chaos that it brings. But I also thought it sort of said something to me about the human condition generally, and that I found a particular interest. I also found an interest in, I'd done a certain amount of managing people anyway, in a former life in a clinic and so on, which was unrelated to addiction. And I found, people sort of sometimes strangely listened to what I had to say, which is quite surprising. And people, one thing after another, people kept asking me to do things, and eventually they asked me to take over running the clinic of the treatment centre, and then they asked me to take over running the charity which owned the treatment centre, and I said, I don't know anything about running charities, you better get someone else. And they said, oh, you'll do, or words to that effect. So that's where it sort of started, and I took over this treatment centre, and I saw great opportunities. And I also looked at the charitable objects, as they're called, what the charity's supposed to be doing. So I said, well, if we're going to be true to the charity's set up for the people it's supposed to benefit, so we ought to be doing the other things. We ought to be doing things like research, training people how to work in this field, working with families and so on. So I set about to fulfill some of those purposes that were set out in the original documents of the charity. And we ended up doing all that. And then I also had a concern that there were too many charities in the field. So I merged the three charities into one that was called Action on Addiction. And it did all of these different things. And I felt it was very important to do things that were not being done in the field, or to the standard particularly that needed to be done. Because I thought one of the things I noticed was there was a tendency for people with addictive problems to invite people to treat them badly. It was part of the condition. So I said, you have to do exactly the opposite, which is you have to treat them extremely well, and you have to provide them with the right environment in which they can feel safe enough to make the changes and so on. And the other big step I took was I went to my board of trustees one day and I said, it was in a different building, and I said, we believe we're doing some good in that house over there. We don't know we are. And I'd like some money to evaluate what we're doing. And they sort of sat back and took a breath and said, two things. What if it shows we're not doing any good? And how much is it going to cost? And I said to the first question, if it shows we're not doing any good, I'm going to say, hello everyone, we're not doing any good and we're going to change so that we are doing some good. And I told them what they cost. Anyway, I talked them around to it, and we had an independent evaluated study. And it was so important. It put us on the map. It gave us the confidence to be self-critical, self-examining, and we grew in stature as a result. And it enabled us, I think, then to develop other things, attract more funding from charitable donors and so on. Then there was another big change in the sort of context in which we were working. You probably heard of the NHS. There was a point when the NHS became opened up to providers from outside it, and so I saw an opportunity there for us to provide service to people funded by the NHS. And it worked extremely well for about a year and a half. And then they changed systems again, and things began to not work. So it became a bit of a struggle, an endless struggle to try and get sufficient funding to help people with life-threatening condition, from all over the country and sometimes further afield. And I could never understand why it was, in the early days I couldn't, why it was acceptable to deny people the funding and the quality of service that, for something that was quite evidently life-threatening. And yet if that was some other condition, there would have been no question. So I had to put it down to stigma, that there's an inherent cultural stigma against addiction which is more powerful than we possibly imagine and keeps coming back to undermine the quality and the purposes that we're all set in trying to improve things for people who suffer in this way. So that was another really important development was the work with families, because I had been in a former life, one of my roles had been as a family therapist, and when I came in, I got the impression that people approached the family simply to say, could you dish the dirt on this one in a rather punitive way? And I thought, that's not going to help. And so what we decided was take a more systemic view, and I got people trained properly in systemic family therapy and tried to then integrate the two approaches, and it seemed to work very well. When we started family programs, it was really instead of always talking about the addicted person, we turned to the family members and said, and how are you? Sometimes they'd never even thought, how am I? And when I first asked that question in a room of 16 people, something like 5 burst into tears. So I thought, oh my God, I've trodden on something here. And things developed from there. And then eventually we developed it, and I thought, we've got to go further all the time. The next thing was we have to help the children whose parents are addicted. So I'm grateful for developing something, evaluating how it's working, and then if possible disseminating it. And so we developed a program called Moving Parents and Children Together, which interestingly spells impact. So, which was a name one of my staff came up with. Always give credit where it's due. And this was a properly evaluated program, and we used to get families together from different families at the same time, with all the children, the parents, and some were using, some weren't. It was amazing. Things began to happen, particularly not just for the children but for the parents also. And I always remember one of the things that came out in the evaluation was the parents almost universally saying, we didn't know how much they knew. So their denial was, of the effects of their behaviour was having. But it allowed the children, in front of other children, to say, this is what it's like, which was brilliant. So, and then the other thing I realised early on, I said to a colleague who was a counsellor, I said, where do you go in this country to train if you want to train as an addictions counsellor? And he said, there isn't anywhere, and I want to do something about it. And he was quite clearly the brightest of the bunch, and academically and all the rest of it. So I said, all right, you design and do all the stuff, I'll get the money and we'll develop them. So we did, and together we ended up getting accepted by the University of Bath with a proper degree course, with proper qualifications, so that the career could have some value to it, validity to it, because otherwise it was, you're a bit you're a counsellor. So there was proper academic and practical training, which lifted the whole game again, and I'm very keen on that. And in fact, one of the things I did nationally was to help write sets of standards for the first time. That led to the founding of something called the European Association of the Treatment of Addiction, IATA or EATA. And I was one of the co-founders, and I eventually became chairman of that for about 8 years. And at that time, there was very much a sort of dichotomy between the abstinence sector and recovery sector on the one hand, and the harm reduction model on the other. And I could never understand, again, retaining some of my outsider perspective. You're all trying to help these people, and yet you're at loggerheads, and there's this massive sort of split and gap. It makes no sense, and it's also reprehensible. Should be talking to each other and working together to find how do these things complement and should they. But somehow they love to stay in those positions, in the split position. And it's still, I believe, to this day, the same thing. It became very ideological, which I could, again, it was never really, ultimately, I felt about the people who were trying to help. It was about something going on with the people holding these strong positions. Opened up the membership to the EATA to a wider group, so that it brought in the harm reduction and got them talking to each other. I don't know how much good it did, but it was worth doing, I think. And the standards thing was picked up by the national government, and that was further developed. But any time there was less money to go around, of course, they didn't care if the standards went right down again. Didn't really matter. And that's where I think it's all okay because of the stigma thing. These are people with just a bloody nuisance, self-inflicted injuries. They cause trouble, they cause crime, and so on. There was a great step forward when, in fact, we got out of the Blair government, Tony Blair's government, a lot of money, but it was all based on trying to reduce crime and by investing in treatment. Not a bad idea, you'd think. But what happened, it became a rather perverse situation where some people started thinking they had to commit crimes to get treatment. So your crime reduction strategy ended up sometimes being a crime production strategy, which is bizarre and absurd, but there you are, that's how it was. And all sorts of political things made the landscape in which we were operating increasingly difficult. Particularly if you were trying to treat people from different parts of the country, you would have 143 different areas, which would all have their own approach. So you would then, maybe you had somebody from there and somebody from there, and it might be quite a different arrangement, and yet you had to make all these individual arrangements. You were quite a small organisation, it was very difficult indeed. Again, always, all the time, the person at the end who you're actually trying to do something for is the one person who ends up being forgotten, which I found, again, I just railed against that all the time. All the good that was done was sort of in spite of rather than because of, a lot of the time. And I was always struck by how much passion there was for the work, and how much commitment to improving, despite all the obstacles and the resistance to these things that was in the system. So I think some things have improved. And I think we're in this strange thing all the time where we make some progress and then it just sort of slips back again and you think, oh, not again. And it'd be nice to hold on, integrate and build on the progress that's made, more than having to retrieve things because they've now been lost again. I think the attack on stigma is absolutely one of the most important things to do, because it will help people improve their understanding of what it is we've got, what people are suffering from, which they could very easily be suffering from, the general public, the huge numbers probably are, but so that it's much more acceptable to say, you know what, I've got this, or I had that, or like any other problem. If you remember, cancer was extremely stigmatized at one point. But now people say, well, I had cancer, or I had this, or I did have it, or somebody died of it. Why can't we do the same with addiction? And that's what I think serious campaigns are major to just say, look, stop all this. This is crazy stuff. Let's stop judging people on this and say, I mean, one of the things I was talking to somebody else about when I was we were working with families and the children and so on, because they were all worried somebody was going to judge them because of it. And I said, look at it this way. Addiction has emerged in this family for whatever reason, right? Let's work together to see if we can get it out, which will come from you guys, having a different relationship, having different communication. Yeah. So no one person was made to feel you're the problem, you're the fault, but everybody also had the opportunity to go, well, maybe I had, played this part for some reason or other. So I think it's shifting that whole cultural mindset. And I think it's also highly trivialized. It's a strange thing to say, but I think addiction, because it's so often thought of as, famous people who go to rehab, it's somehow thought it's not very serious. That's something that you do as part of your life. You go to rehab, and you get better and you carry on, you have a career. So it's easy to dismiss, and it shouldn't be, because it's so serious and so important to understand it and to help. Now, you talked about treatment. I'm of the view that the word treatment itself is an obstacle. We need to move away from that to saying, how do people recover from this? How do they, whether that's families or the person who's drinking or using or whatever. And because treatment was the old idea of we do something to somebody and they get better, which actually to me was very much in line with the addiction model, which is I feel rotten, or I feel this or that, I'm going to fix it. Going to do something. So it has a parallel. And I think the other thing we don't recognize sufficiently is that the character of addiction infuses a lot of our approaches to it and undermines it. It's a very powerful, as you know, a very powerful force, and very clever at making you work absolutely opposite to your interests. I mean, I'll give you one example, which is when funding's around, people react to funding as if it's a rare form of heroin that they haven't had yet. So they start fighting each other for it. Yeah? And it becomes highly competitive. becomes highly competitive, and you know, you'll kill your granny to get that bit of funding that you've heard of that nobody else has. And I found that fascinating, a strange sort of parallel with you know, so that the people with the money became the dealers, and the money became the drug. And people got anxiously disappointed or elated when it was around. I mean, all the things. So if we don't understand how powerful addiction is in its ability to infuse our very thoughts and behavior, not just the people with it, but everyone else involved, we will make the same mistakes again and again and again. We should be ashamed. We know more and more about evidence. Because still I hear a lot of like, I believe this. Well, okay, that's nice. I believe this is the way. Okay, I hear it's your belief, but you know, that's like I said to my trustees all those years, we believe but we don't know. So let's get clear about what we know, and let's find out, let's increase that knowledge base so we can be confident and go to others and say, we know this, not we believe it. Because if you say I believe it and you have no evidence, they knock you down like that, and so you never get anywhere. So yeah, and as I said, shift the focus from treatment to recovery, a self-directed recovery, which is supported by other people to do. Because I think recovery is trying to happen anyway. Actually, I'll tell you this, I think addiction results from trying to get well by the wrong means. And it's very clever because it tells you in the end, this is the wrong means. Look what's happening to you. So you then have a choice to go in a different direction. So I think it's a clever thing. Let's look at the context around us. You know, I mean, is it any wonder? I mean, we live in a massively consuming environment. I mean, I think of addiction as an all-consuming relationship. You consume, it consumes around you. We live in a society which is all-consuming. Everything is being consumed and it's costing us enormously. But we somehow divorce, you know, and these, maybe everyone with addiction is signaling to us somehow, this is what's wrong, you know. And probably at the bottom of it is somebody who's unhappy, miserable,
Yes.
hurting, needy, you know, all of those things, which they've only, you know, and society tells you it's only one way to deal with that. Buy something, eat something, smoke something, drink something, yeah, and keep doing it. I mean, I was fascinated, I don't know if you know Waterloo Station in London, one of them, our main railway stations. So I come out of there and I look around and I think, this is incredible. There must be 40 food outlets within immediate vision as I come off the train and I walk through the barrier and I look around. Now, when I was a young lad, there wouldn't have been any of that. There'd have been a newspaper stand, possibly selling some chewing gum or something. But all these, eat this, eat, you know, why? So we crank up the anxiety and then we provide the response to it. And so it becomes circular. And that's why I say if we want to make progress, we have to go even more radical than we've ever dared to actually think about the society where this is actually happening and what's facilitating, fostering, nurturing, fertilizing, if you like, that kind of behavior. And the question is, what do you find most helpful when that's happening? That's what today we have to ask people. What's most helpful when you're in that state that so takes you over, consumes you? And often people will say, well, if I have somebody to turn to, if I have somebody to tell somebody about it as a starting point, as I understand it. And I think that tells us something profound, which is, as somebody once said, addiction is about a state of disconnection. You know, if you get connected and you involve other people and get their support and encouragement and so on, it's much easier to progress and to keep progressing. I retired from running the charity about 4 years ago, amazingly. And I went walking to get the responsibility off my shoulder. Yeah. You know, suddenly there was that moment. Oh, it's gone. I'm not in charge of all. I don't have to think about this 24 hours a day, which was great. I'm so grateful to have had that experience. then people started asking me, would I do this, would I do that, and would I do the other? Could I help with it? And I set up a consultancy, and that's what I do bits and pieces of now, and I'm trying to write a book or two, which is a good way not to write either.
You have a wonderful sense of humor.
Well, there's a wonderful thing in psychology, and a certain branch of psychology, which is called a snag, which is, I'm going to do this, yeah?
Yeah.
And you find a way, just, the snag when you catch yourself on something?
Right.
Yeah? And it just, you end up not doing the thing you say you desperately want to do.